All right. Hey, everybody, welcome in, welcome in. We're going to give it just like probably one more minute here for any last folks joining. I know we're already a couple of minutes after 2 p.m. Eastern, so we will get started in just a moment. Please feel free, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, you can drop your name, your organization if you're part of one, and maybe where you're tuning in from today. All right, and with that, I will go ahead and kick us off here. So welcome to today's training. It is Communicating in Coalition, and we're really going to focus on some different aspects of communication in coalitions, so specifically interpersonal and then intergenerational communication styles today. So glad you are all here. I think also we are going to have a bit of a more intimate group. We are in like the meeting format instead of the webinar format. So if possible, if you want to come off camera, we definitely encourage it. We'll all be getting to know each other and kind of working through some more interactive activities today. So should be a good, fun training. All right, and so like I said, here's kind of the overview of the training today. So one of the most valuable strengths of working in coalition together is that coalitions provide spaces for people with diverse experiences, backgrounds, and opinions to come together and work toward a common goal. So understanding and respecting different communication styles is vital to strengthening our collaboration. So today we're going to be exploring different communication styles and how those different styles influence our organizing work. And we'll be going over, like I said, some activities to kind of uncover more about our own individual communication styles, and then also just kind of working to integrate those into our relationships with others. So like I said, at the top, my name is Maggie. I am the Communications and Digital Marketing Manager here with Midwest BDC. Previously, I've worked in communications at the Ohio Environmental Council. I'm based in the state of Ohio, and I received my bachelor's degree in communication and cinema from Denison University in Ohio. And while pursuing that degree, I lived at the Denison Homestead, which is an off-grid intentional living learning community that really centers sustainability, connection with the outdoors, and also communal leadership practices. So that kind of really got me into both like this like sustainable energy justice, environmental justice work, but then also this kind of approach really focusing on the communications. And before I go on, I see Anna commented that the slides might be being cut off a little bit. Let me adjust my screen. Okay, let me know if that's any better.
Yep,
And
that's
if not,
perfect.
okay, cool, thank you. And joining me today, just chiming in there, is Stephanie Bowman. So Stephanie will also be leading us through this training. And Stephanie is the Senior Manager of Learning and Member Success at Mothers Out Front. After receiving her degree in political science from Hampton University, she began organizing from Virginia, Wisconsin to Kansas. 6 states later, she decided to continue to graduate school at Cornell in marketing strategy. And upon completion, she felt disgusted thinking about the transactional treatment by party politics. Her increased knowledge in marketing blatantly showed the intentional exclusion of using proven methodologies to engage people of color. Her passion is in building relationships, managing teams, and moving towards measurable change. All right, let's keep it moving here. So our agenda today, I'm going to go over this kind of intro section real quickly and tell you a little bit more about Midwest BDC if you're new to our space. Then Stephanie's going to lead us in an icebreaker and a crossword key term trivia activity. Then we're going to jump into types of interpersonal communication and common types of conflict you might encounter while working in coalitions. Then we're going to go into intergenerational breakouts. We're going to kind of explore intergenerational communication a little more. Then we're going to go into intercultural breakouts where we're going to explore that a little bit more. We do have a smaller group today, so we might just stay in this main session with everybody. So it might be a little switch up, but we'll see when we get there. And then finally, as our kind of closing activity, we're going to go over the characteristics of white supremacy culture and then also the antidotes we can use to combat those in our work. So, like I said, just a little bit about Midwest BDC. Our mission is to develop and implement equitable strategies to achieve zero emissions from the Midwestern building sector by 2050. And here at the coalition, we define the Midwest as Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois, Wisconsin, Ohio, Missouri, Indiana, and Iowa. We definitely have members coming from outside of that region. So if you're not from one of those states or not residing in one of those states, absolutely fine. This is just kind of our focus area for our coalition's work. And real quick, I wanted to go over the Hermes Principles for Democratic Organizing. This is a framework that Midwest BDC's advocacy and organizing is really rooted in. So these principles are 1, be inclusive, 2, an emphasis on bottom-up organizing, 3, let people speak for themselves, 4, work together in solidarity and mutuality, 5, build just relationships amongst ourselves, and 6, a commitment to self-transformation. And then in our Midwest BDC trainings and webinars, we use these community norms. So I will, again, go through these really quickly because I know we have a lot to get to today. So our community norms at Midwest BDC spaces are remember our why, focus on the work, notice intent, lean towards impact, use I statements, practice self-awareness, stop and witness, assume good intentions, listen for understanding, not to respond, wait, why am I talking or why aren't I talking? Practice active listening. Everyone's a teacher, everyone's a learner. Share responsibility for keeping to the norms. Do not dominate meetings for personal or organizational self-interest. Respect meeting facilitators. Adhere to speak next indicators. Usually we use that as like the raise hand function on Zoom. Show up in your authentic self. Speak to the whole group. Minimize jargon, explain terms when you're asked, and participate and lean into discomfort. All right, and now I'm gonna actually pause my screen share real quick because I'm still getting a couple comments that it's coming across a little bit funky, so I'm gonna switch that up. 1 second. Okay, here we go. All right, hopefully that's looking a little bit better for everybody, but if not, go ahead and feel free to let me know. So, and then this is also just a note of feel free to rename yourself. We already had folks introduce themselves in the chat, which is so great, but feel free to go ahead and rename yourself on Zoom and add your name and location so we all know how to properly address each other, especially when we get into those interactive activities that are going to be happening in a little bit. All right, and so today, thank you again for joining us for Communicating in Coalition Building, and I will turn it over to Stephanie now to get us started.
Hey everyone, thank you for having me and joining us for today's session. Maggie did a wonderful overview of the things that we're going to cover today. And let's just get started. I see folks checking in the chat saying where they are located, but let's just do a check-in and for folks to share in the chat how you are arriving. And also, if you had to give a score, 1 to 5, about your experiences working in coalition, give a 5 if you're like, best experience of my life. I love it. Rarely an interpersonal thing ever comes up. Put a 5 in the chat. And if you're like, this is absolutely the thing that I hate the most about this work is being in coalition, because there's tons of interpersonal stuff that shows up for me. Put a 1 in the chat. And if you're somewhere in the middle where you're like, meh, I kind of like it sometimes, it's a hit or miss. Sometimes it's great. Sometimes it can be a lot. Put a 3 in the chat. This is a judge-free zone, y'all. We're just checking in to kind of see how folks are arriving. All right, I see some 3s, some 3.5, some 4s. And it's okay if you're a 1 out there. Okay. Just giving a little bit more time for a few more folks to respond. Okay. Yes. So I see many of us are kind of in the middle. We're like, hey, we see and we feel it pop up, but we still enjoy some components of our coalition work. But as we know, interpersonal conflict can significantly impact our ability to build and maintain lasting coalitions. Often, when conflicts arise, they can erode trust. They can hinder collaboration, and they can also just disrupt our ability to communicate with each other honestly and authentically. So, the purpose of today's session is that we want everyone to gain an understanding on how we can address these conflicts, on ways to identify how they show up, and then also providing some ways and some helpful practices on how we can begin to continue to build trust, mediation, and also knowing that coalitions can overcome challenges and work more cohesively towards their objectives once we name what types of interpersonal things consistently keep showing up. And then lastly, we're going to dive into recognizing and challenging white supremacy culture within coalitions, and knowing that it's also crucial for us to ensure that they're inclusive and they bring equity in our coalition work. So depending on what time zone you're on, it can be a lot to be saying white supremacy culture at noon or 2 o'clock on your Thursday, but it is something that's really unconscious and it's embedded in a lot of the ways that we operate, or we're even taught by our educational institutions on how to operate with each other. So let's go to the next slide. So participation looks like, as you all can tell, is we're going to be looking at our slide deck and listening. I'm super big in doing temperature chats, and we'll flex the training based on how things resonate with you all and where you would deem it being most helpful. So if you are driving, I don't want you to risk your life to put a number in the chat, but it does really help Maggie and myself to be able to flex on the fly to meet you all's needs. Our goal ideally is to be able to do some breakouts, but if that doesn't happen because we don't have enough of us, we'll just do it all here in the group chat. If there's ever a time where I'm using language, I'm throwing out acronyms, abbreviations, things that you're like, what does that mean? Please hold me accountable, y'all. Put your questions in the chat. I am not offended. That is part of our accessibility and equity to this work. So let's keep going. All right. So I know some folks who are on this call are like, communication's my profession. So I'm not going to lean in too much here, but I think it's important to talk about the framing for today's training. We're not going to talk about all the types of communication that exist in our work. We only have 90 minutes. We're really going to dive into 2 to 3 major components, which you will see as 2, 3, and 4. We're going to lean into interpersonal communication, how we engage with each other, and some of those unconscious biases that impact our ability to receive and give good feedback. There's also some nuances because when you're in a coalition, there's this small group communication. And that small group communication generally, can show up in different ways depending on how small your group is. What are the generations in the group? What are the cultural experiences of folks? And then there's organizational communication. That's usually the organizations in which we're operating in, the culture that they disseminate that kind of trickles down into how our coalitions operate. So as you can tell, there's tons of other ones: public communication, mass communication, social media communication. We don't have time for that today. So we're going to be focusing primarily on interpersonal under the guise of talking slightly about small group and organizational. So when we talk about interpersonal communication, this is that communication that's between 2 persons or among a small group of persons. Often in our coalition work, it can be some of the working groups, folks who are working on certain issues and things like that, and how we interact with each other. Now, the small group communication is slightly more, it's broader than that, right? It's the communication of members who are 3 to 20 people who often have a common goal. So when we think about this coalition, it could fall under the guise of a small group communication, depending on what you all are working on. But if it expands past 20 people and it has some norms and some cultural and some formal and informal standards that are set, then that would bring it into this organizational communication. And so often when we start talking about interpersonal, the culture of an organization can even impact our ability and how we engage with each other, even in that one-to-one. Alrighty. So we're just going to do a little bit of an activity. It's nothing like a crossword on a Thursday to get you pumped up. And there are some common key terms that we have around this work. And so what I'll do is I'll read one of the numbers. I'll give you a hint on what letters it is. And if you feel like you know the answer, we're just going to do this popcorn style, and feel free to share in the chat. So number one down are disagreements within a coalition. It is 9 letters, and it's going down. A hint could be it starts with the letter C. Yes, there we go. Conflict. See, we have some crossword folks in here. Yes, conflict. So that's a disagreement that often can come up in our coalition. We're going to talk a little bit about the types of conflict because it makes it easier for us to identify ways in which to respond. So let's move the 2 down. So as you can tell, 2 down is long. It is actually something I just gave a definition of on an earlier slide. It is the ways coalition members exchange information. Generally in a, I can't use the word, but generally with people that make up more than 2 to 20 folks. And it's a way in which we exchange information. It's one of the types of communication I just said earlier. But for 2 to 20 folks. All right. Yes, group communication. I see y'all getting close. Yeah, so it's group communication. Those are ways in which our coalition members exchange information. Exactly. All right, so let's do 3 down, y'all. This is the last one that is going down. So it's only 5 letters. And it's our goal in doing coalition work. It's that confidence in coalition members' reliability. Yes, Ashley, trust. Trust. That is our confidence in our coalition members' reliability, their respectability, their ability to make decisions with us in mind. Absolutely. Trust. So let's move to across. So these are those groups that are united for a shared goal. We were just talking about those different types of groups, and there's that group that has that common shared goal. A coalition, yes. Michelle, I need you to fill out my crosswords. You are on it. Yes, so let's do 5 across. These are those norms that are prioritizing white values in coalition. It's a 3-word answer that I alluded to earlier about. It's the very last thing we're going to dive into today together. Yes, Michelle, white supremacy culture. Yes, those are those norms. So let's do 6 across, interactions between coalition members. And this is generally 2 or less. It's more of that one-to-one conversations that we're having. Yes, interpersonal. Exactly. And then cooperative efforts towards coalition goals. This is 7 across.
Well, that Michelle is on it.
Absolutely, Lena.
That's smart.
It's okay. The cooperative efforts towards coalition goals. And it's usually our end goal. Not only do we want trust in our coalitions, but we want this C word that has 2 L's in it. Collaboration. Absolutely. We need to have a prize for this. And so then the very last one, which is 8 across, is the neutral party that's resolving coalition disputes. And so sometimes when it gets a little heavy, we have to bring these folks in. Yes. Mediators, moderators, yes. All right. Thank y'all so much for participating in this crossword activity. This slide will be available to you if it's something you want to bring back to your organizations. This is just a great way to get us warmed up together. These are the answers. But yeah, y'all, this is just some of the key terms that we're going to cover today in this session. All right, so we know that trust and coalitions can be both impacted by two different things. This isn't restrictive. There's tons of other factors, but in regards to today's training, we're really going to be talking about generational as well as racial/cultural. And often this shows up in communication mishaps or misperceptions on how we receive information from folks. And so the reason why this matters is that we have these common types of conflicts. And so whenever you all witness a conflict, a great practice that I do for myself is I jot down, is this a process conflict? Is this a personal conflict? Or is this a priority conflict? And so a process conflict is when we have disagreements about the logistics of a task completion. We may say, hey, you want us to meet and work in groups every week and then create an agenda. And then after it, we should come up with this outcome. And so folks may just have a disagreement in the process, right? Often what influences our process is that it's those formal rules, right? Those systems. If you have running meeting notes, is it your workflow processes? Is it your note taker? Is it different role definitions? But it can also be affected by our implicit biases regarding how tasks should be performed. All right. So then we have personal conflict. Personal conflict are those incompatibilities that create tension and animosity. Often that can just be, I say y'all. Some people may view me saying y'all as something that is not considered professional, but I consider it being something that's gender ambiguous. So when I'm working in groups of larger folks and I don't know if folks identify as she, as him, as they, as them, I'll use a gender non-conforming term to encompass everyone instead of saying ladies and gentlemen. But for other folks, they may view that as offensive, that I'm saying y'all. And so often personal conflict can be really rooted in our own implicit or explicit biases. Yeah, and then another way personal conflict can show up is when we're across generations. In some spaces, it's okay to say, hey, girls, but depending on the elders in the room, calling someone over a certain age a girl can be deemed very offensive. And so often personal conflict can be a misconception of processing terms and how we refer to each other. And we take it very personally. So then we have the third type of conflict, which is priority. And so priority conflict are those disagreements about the importance or urgency of tasks and goals. And so often the urgency can be influenced by those formal organizational priorities and systems. You may have certain deadlines that you're working under because of deliverables from funders. You may be really feeling that the priority of this campaign is super extractive because it's not prioritizing what's really resonating with people on the ground. And so often priority conflict can feel personal if the priority is deprioritizing your issue, right? And so that's why it's really helpful when you're seeing conflict and coalition to jot down for yourself if it's a process, if it's personal, and if it's priority. So by understanding these types of communication and conflict, it really helps us recognize that if it's influenced by those formal rules, if it's influenced by those implicit biases, and it also helps us to better navigate how we interact with them and to ensure that we work more effectively in our coalition once we know if it's a process, a priority, or if it's personal. So before we move into the next section, I just want to do a temperature check. So if you had to pick one of these that you all witnessed the most in your coalition work, go ahead and share it in the chat. If it's process, type process or put a 1. If it's personal, put 2 or put personal in the chat. And if it's priority, it's like, man, the priorities just are completely unaligned. Go ahead and put a 3 or put priority in the chat. And there's no wrong answer, y'all. This is just a temp check. You're like all the P's. That's also okay. So I see personal, I see priority. Process, yeah, I see another personal. And so sometimes it can feel like it's all of the above, right? And it's okay. But it's important as you're witnessing it, especially if you're not the person participating in the conflict, to kind of jot down really what it is. Is this personal? Have y'all just went back and forth so many times and now everything you all discuss is personal? Or is this something that's really rooted in our process and how we operate as an organization? All right. So the reason why we started off with the types of conflict is across generations, there are different perceptions on what these conflicts feel like, what they could be perceived as. And so where we're going to start, and I don't want anyone to say their age, there's no pressure to that. But if you can identify in the chat what generation group that you're a part of, if you are a maturist, which means pre-1945, if you are a baby boomer, you could go ahead and put baby boomer. If you're a Gen X, you can put Gen X. If you're a Gen Y, you can put Gen Y. Or if you're a Gen Z. Now, if you're like, okay. If you don't know what those are, baby boomers were born 1945 to 1960. Generation X is considered 1961 to 1980. And then Gen Y is 1981 to 1995. And then we're in Gen Z, which is born after 1995. Yes. So great. I see some Gen Zers on here, some Gen Y, some Gen X, an elder millennial, judge-free zone. Yes. So as I go through, I'm going to talk about some common experiences of them. And if you feel like that resonates with you, you're like, yeah, that kind of describes me, go ahead and put a plus in the chat. And as I go through some of their preferred communication and things like that, feel free, if it aligns with you, to put a plus in the chat. And if not, just put a negative. You're like, no, this is not me. I'm an outlier. I'm a different baby boomer. That's also okay. We're all different in how we show up in the world. So let's start with maturists. For many of us, this may be our grandparents, our parents, and what they experienced in their lifetime is many of them witnessed wartime rationing, right? What it means when the infrastructure of our country has failed us to the point where we have to ration. Rock and roll, the ideology of having nuclear families, defined gender roles, particularly for women. So then often there's an attitude towards career, that there's jobs for life, right? Like if you work somewhere, you work hard, you stay there 20 years, you go through all of you go through everything, you pick yourself up, and that you're committed there for life. Some of the signature products that were like invented in their lifetime that were super important were automobiles. As far as communication media, this generation tends to prefer formal letters as well as mailers and postcards. In this time of year, since it's election season, this generation tends to be targeted more with mail, right? Like they'll get more postcards to their door. They'll have more of those letters being sent to them. And then preference when making that financial decisions. And the reason why I bring this up is often sometimes in coalitions when we're deciding on campaigns and we're working together, we are leaning sometimes into financial decisions. They prefer face-to-face meetings, right? So now let's move into baby boomers. Their lived experience were Cold War, the swinging 60s, the moon landing when science was being prioritized at a global and national level, youth culture, Woodstock, and being family oriented. So attitude towards career, organizational careers are defined by the employees. This is when we started having a shift in the ideology of jobs for life versus jobs that are rooted in organizational careers, that they're defined by their employees. The signature product was television, right? Shifting from the radio to being able to have television, and it's shifting from black and white to color and all of those things, as well as communication media. A lot of baby boomers prefer a phone call. And if you're an outlier and you're like, that is not me, go ahead, put a negative in the chat. These are just data set assumptions. And then the last is face-to-face ideally, but increasingly will go online. So now let's move to Gen X, y'all. So Gen Xers, because I know there's a few of us here on the call. what you may have experienced within your lifetime was the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Reagan administration, witnessing what live aid looks like. Early mobile technology. The Gen X generation is a generation of transformation. They went through 6 different eras of technology upgrades, from those of you that were like, ooh, Atari was the best. And then it transitioned to Sega, to Super Nintendo, to what are we at now? Xbox, PlayStation 7? I don't know. But we've had such a transition in technology, even from our phones. And then also experiencing this pushback of this nuclear family, where divorce rates became on the rise for this generation. And so many Gen Xers came from either families that were still nuclear families, or also just families that were segmented, because this was a generation of women liberation also, when a lot of women were like, do I need to stay with someone if they're abusive or harmful? Oh, I actually have rights to get a divorce and get property? Oh my goodness. And so this is that generation where there was a huge evolution that occurred. So that also showed up in the attitude towards career. Many were portfolio careers. They were loyal to a profession, but not to the employer. Gen Xers traditionally will leave an employer if their values are not aligned with their own, but they have loyalty to their actual profession. The signature product is having your own personal computer, as well as preferred method of communication tends to be email and text message. And then when we talk about the preferences when making financial decisions, online would prefer face-to-face if time was permitting, but sending me an email with a link that can go to it, chef's kiss. I would definitely prefer that. So now let's shift to Gen Y. I see there's a good amount of you on here as well. So your lived experience, 9/11. Many Gen Yers were in high school when the World Trade Centers were hit. Social media, the launching of Facebook. A lot of us were in high school or middle school, or in our first few years of college when Facebook was launching, and it was only meant for colleges. And now everybody and their mama is on Facebook now. Yes, MySpace too. Can't believe that. Yes, the good old days. Also, Gen Y witnessed the invasion of Iraq, right? Under the guise of weapons of mass destruction. And then, you know, one of the best things that our generation experienced was reality TV. We remember Real World, Bad Girls Club. I feel like there's tons of other reality TV shows that were going on at that time. And as well as the Google Earth, having random cars driving through your neighborhood with cameras on them, taking pictures of homes was like, okay, that's kind of weird, but okay, we're in Google Earth. Yes, Tom was everyone's friend on MySpace. And then attitude towards careers is many are digital entrepreneurs where they work with organizations, but they still like to have autonomy to be able to be entrepreneurs on their own, which, as you can see from Gen Xers, is like that evolution. So then their signature product, y'all, it's tablets and smartphones. That's why many Gen Yers, we have our phones attached to us in some way. And it goes along with us having a preference of being communicated with via text or social media. Now, still, what I find so interesting is the preference when making financial decisions still goes back to face-to-face. And so now let's lean into Gen Z. So some of the Gen Z's lived experience was the economic downturn. Within their lifetime, they have witnessed our government attempt to shut down consistently. Global warming, witnessing all these natural disasters, hurricanes, wildfires, animals extinction. The list could continue to go on, right? Mobile devices. The fact that we aren't using razor flip phones. I don't know if y'all remember those little thin razors that everyone thought they were cool in Gen Y and Gen X. Yes, what are those? Or sidekicks? No, within their lifetime, we have smart computers, right? Then there's cloud computing. For Gen X, Gen Y, and baby boomers, we had CDs, floppy disk, USB flash drives. But for Gen Z, I mean, cloud computing and saving things in the cloud is normal, right? It's like the standard, as well as WikiLeaks, shifting into this not traditional media, where before baby boomers, Gen X, we were leading into common sources of media, common news stations, newspapers, as sources of our media. And now for Gen Z, you know, it can be WikiLeaks. And so when we go into attitude towards career, this is just like an evolution of how we have changed as humans under this capitalistic structure known as our democracy, where Gen Z are multitaskers. They will move seamlessly between organizations and pop-up businesses without that loyalty to a particular organization where they believe in jobs for life, right? When it comes to signature product, which I still push back on this one, is it says the signature product are things like Google Glass or 3D printing or some of those next step of products that are happening within their lifetime. Then there's communication media. So that's that handheld communication device, whatever that is for you, if it's a tablet, if it's a phone. And then the very last is preference when making financial decisions. Solutions will be digitally crowdsourced. So I see a great question in the chat. Michelle, I'm not sure I understand the baby boomer organizational attitude towards career. Does that mean they are more likely to stay at a job based on experience with coworkers? Yeah, so it was like the idea and the narrative that if you find a good job, good union paying job, and you stay there 20 years, they'll do you right? They won't just let you off with a few days notice, right? They'll treat you respectfully. You'll have certain benefits. And it was kind of that idea of not only do you have a nuclear family, but you need that job for life.
Okay, that kind of makes more sense. They also had, I'm not sure what generation this really goes up to, but pensions were more common.
Yeah, so that would be that maturist and baby boomer generation where pensions were more common because we were committed to the actual institution, right? Like that job that you're staying with, or if you have that organizational career where you're committed to a particular organization. A great question. And as our country has evolved, right, the ability to even have access to some of those resources, depending on certain jobs, has shifted, right? So even for certain Gen Zers, where will we find those jobs that give you pensions, right? All right, I see someone else saying much more fluid attitude to career. Signature product is laptop, tablet, smartphone. Communication media, our telephone, email, text, preference for final decisions and all options. Yes, tuition reimbursement was a common baby boomer era, right? The belief that if I work hard, I go to school, that the government will invest in me and either pay me back, clear my student loans. And for some of the later generations, we're not afforded that same hope, right? And so the reason why we start off here in generations, y'all, is we all have our own lived experience that brings us to our coalition work. And often when we're getting in conversations of like, oh, someone never makes it to a meeting, they never respond to my email, we have to bring ourselves back to, well, what generation are they? Am I trying to communicate with them in the method that is most comfortable for them? Because part of doing equity work is meeting people where they are. Even in a coalition, although we try to set some norms and standards, if a third of your coalition are Gen Z and you only do emails, I may suggest that you probably have a text group, right? If a third of your coalition are Gen X, then it's like you may have to do a both and approach and send an email with a text message. And just knowing that the more we do a cross-generation work, we have to extend even our own right to comfort, that you may be a one-to-one conversation on a telephone person all day, but your own right to comfort doesn't allow us to do coalition work well across generations if you're not willing to extend yourself and say, okay, I know I'm always trying to call someone and they never answer my call and then they reply with the text instead of me taking it personal, the types of conflict, I should probably step back and think, is this a process thing. Maybe their process when receiving information is written and my process for receiving information is verbal, and to not take it personal. Yes. Sometimes sometimes folks do not prefer face to face, but it can also be a part of your energy. And see, at different times of our life, y'all, we only have a certain amount of capacity. And so if there's tons of things going on in your life and you're on the verge of a breakdown, the last thing you may need is a one-to-one face-to-face conversation with someone, right? And so it's also just knowing that like we have to meet each other where we're at generationally, but also know that life is lifing. Y'all, 2024 has been great and terrible for many of us. And so also just to know that giving grace, that folks' preference and how they wanted to be communicated with is like how we truly do this coalition work well. So this is the part of the training when we usually lean into a breakout, and we will break out into a group for about 15 to 20 minutes. But since it's a small, intimate group of us, I'm thinking we can just do this together. Maggie, what do you think? I saw your head nod.
I like that. We're like about halfway through the training too, which feels like it's gone so quickly. So I think keeping us all together and just moving through it as a group would be a good call.
Okay, perfect. Overuse of acronyms. Yes. Are you saying that, Cheryl, for a particular generation or just in general?
Well, I'm almost 70, and when I was coming along, they didn't use acronyms on the job. Everything was spelled out, and so it's hard to follow the conversation. It takes a while for us to pick up on these acronyms, and it's just like natural with the younger people. It doesn't disturb them, but we had to know so much like perfectly, on our jobs. That was part of being a professional, that you had to know what things meant. You weren't using acronyms.
Yes, definitely. And also acronyms change over time, right? Like what an acronym stood for 30 years ago could have a completely different meaning now.
Yes, yes.
No, absolutely.
It when I started doing this work, I had to kind of sit for months in the meetings because they're all talking, and I'm like, whoa, 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 because usually we had big meetings, they'd have lunch at the table, and you went one by one, and there was a structure that you followed. You get called on. Everything was to the T. So, so you couldn't get lost. But I'm catching on, but it took me a minute.
Yes, and it's definitely a process, right? And when we talk about what type of conflict may arise from that, is you may feel like it's personal, right? Like if you tell someone multiple times, hey, I need you to explain what these acronyms mean, and they keep going without doing it, it can begin to feel personal, but it's really a process conflict, right? Where you set a standard working agreement that we lean into explaining what a lot of those acronyms mean, and not in a condescending way, right? In a respectful way. No, that's so real. So
I love it when people do a sheet of like, acronyms, like a glossary. If they use that more often, then you catch on, because sometimes, like, it was okay to ask questions back in the day, but when you kind of have to stop the conversation because you're lost, that's when people kind of look at you like you're old. And I'm like, I'm not old. It's just we have different experiences.
Absolutely. And just what you did right there is a perfect pivot where you eliminated it being personal. Like, it's not because I'm old, like, excuse you, right? It's
Yeah,
because
let's get out there on the basketball court. Let's see how old I am.
exactly. Um,
That
no,
was the
that is
fun part when I was teaching, because I could be out there with the kids and they didn't realize the age difference.
no, absolutely. And on those same regards, I am sharing a link to a workbook. One of my common equity practices is everything that I say out loud. I provide something for folks who need to follow along as we go. And so this workbook link that I just shared is something that's accessible for you. You can copy it and continue to take notes in it as we go through today. There's also a link to the slide deck, just to lean into that. And if there's ever any jargon that I use on this call, hold me accountable, y'all. Not only will I answer what the jargon is, but I will also make sure I add it into this workbook for you all. So I just want to open it up for a few more folks to share. Were there any common experiences or communication preferences for your generation? And as you think of that, if you would like to discuss how they may have shaped your views and even how you may show up in your coalition. We have time for about 2 people to share about 1 to 2 minutes.
I'll share something. So I don't know if it's a generational thing or not, but people who send like group text messages, and this past week I just received a couple of different communications that were comprised of these group text messages, and to me that's I guess maybe it does in a sense help build or foster community or camaraderie, but I can't stand getting those group text messages from people, because they kind of go on and on with different people putting in their little 2 cents, and um and I just don't find participating or receiving them a productive use of my time. I'll just say that.
No, that's real. Just like Maggie shared, the notifications can be a lot. They can be a little too much. And sometimes group text without some sort of framing can become a place where it's a lot of side conversation that's not getting to an end goal. Right. And so that's often like a working practice when you're setting these across generational group chats, is in the beginning, setting those norms, saying, hey, y'all, this is just for this. I know we may spiral and start sending memes, but that's not what this chat is for. It's actually for X, Y, and Z. Exactly. It can be dangerous if you don't know how to use it. I've definitely seen some people post the wrong picture in a group chat and spiraled out of control. Would anyone else like to share?
Yeah, I kind of have like an opposite experience, if that's all right to share.
Yeah.
Since I'm a part of Gen Z, and this is my first like full-time position out of college. So I educate people on how to electrify their homes. And something that I struggle with is typically I speak to, I would say, older generations, because those tend to be the homeowners, and unfortunately there aren't as many options for renters to electrify. So sometimes there's a bit of like a barrier there, because I think sometimes people look at my age and they're like, oh, she doesn't know what she's talking about. Like, so like building credibility has been something that like I've been focusing on since I started my role. And it's kind of hard to like build that trust, because I wasn't raised in the same home like setup as some of the older generation. And it's also like challenging a core belief of like, gas, this thing that you grew up with your entire life, might actually have some health negative implications. And like it's changing a core belief is also really hard. So that's something that I've come across in my experiences interacting with different generations.
That is so real, Zoe. And when it comes to working across generation, one of the biggest isms that we experience the most is ageism. And it works on both sides, right? Ageism can be the assumption that older folks may not be willing to change their mind. They may not be technology inept. There's all these associations to older folks. And in reverse, a lot of our elders who've been doing this work for 40, 50 years, when they see someone who comes into the room who is younger than how long they've been doing the work, often you feel this imposter syndrome where you have to counter this narrative that you're too young to be an expert, that you're too young to be professional, or even that your views of professionalism may be different, right? For many of the baby boomer generation, being a woman going into the office not wearing a skirt, but wearing pants was deemed as liberatory, right? Like, you are a liberator, you're wearing pants. And now the nuance for many of Gen Z and millennials is like, what do you mean? I'm just wearing pants. Like, women wear pants. And so ageism is definitely something that's very prevalent, which is why I start off with generation, because we have to give each other grace that we have different lived experiences that make us prefer certain forms of communication, even to show up in different ways. And I hear a lot of people resonating with you, Zoe, in the chat. All right. So I want to keep us on track, y'all, because we have a lot to cover. So I want to keep it moving. So this actual image is in your workbook. So it's pretty dense, but it goes a little bit more into some of the key technologies, the preferred communication styles, some of the common hobbies, digital proficiency. And so when you get some time, go in there and just take your time and review it. It's really helpful. It comes from a Pew Research survey that was done. And it was also published in Vanity Fair a while ago. That was just talking about some of the nuances across our generations. And I find it being a very helpful visual as we're identifying how generation and sexism and racism can show up in our work, but specifically across generation, because each generation has evolved, even their perceptions on what women have the right to do, on what people of color have the right to do, and all that nuances show up across our generations. All right, let's keep going. So I think we actually did this. So now that we've done a brief recap, y'all, on understanding our generational communication preferences, let's do a temp check. Put a 5 in the chat if you're like, I completely understand now. At first, I thought it was weird we started off with generational stuff, but it actually kind of makes sense. Go ahead and put a 5 in the chat. If you're like, man, I'm halfway there, but I still don't get it. I'm an outlier. I'm a baby boomer that does code. Go ahead, put a 3 in the chat. And if you're like, not at all, I still don't get how we got here. I just hopped into the room. Go ahead, throw a 1 in the chat. I'm not offended, but this just helps us know where we are, y'all. All right, I see a lot of some 5s, some 4s. Okay, great. All righty, let's keep going as folks continue to vote in the chat. So this next section is we're going to talk about our cultural communication norms. Now, this is a compilation of a whole bunch of different sources about some of the common communication norms rooted on race/culture. And the reason why I say it that way is there's an assumption that everyone who's Black has the same communication norms, right? But the diaspora of what Black may look like is very vast, right? It can be someone who is an African descendant of slavery. They can be an African immigrant. They can, have all these other experiences. So these are just some generalizations. And as I read through them, y'all, if this resonates with you, if you're like, ooh, Stephanie, I felt that, just go ahead and give me a plus in the chat. And if you're like, no, actually, I want to push back on this one, go ahead and put a negative in the chat. This is just for us to kind of jog discussion. Everything that's here in the slide is also written in your workbook. I think it's like on page 4. So in African-American culture, some of the communication norms emphasizes oral traditions, storytelling, and expressive communication. That means using our hands. Often to other folks who may not be used to communicating with folks, they may view that as being aggressive, or someone's being sporadic, or they're using their hands in a way that's offensive. But that's not necessarily the case. It's a cultural norm to use your hands when you speak. Often in African-American culture, we value directness and emotional expressiveness. With often people view direct as being aggressive or being disrespectful. But sometimes we just want to get short to the point and keep it moving, right? Because we have liberation to get to. And so it's important to think about that when you're working in groups of folks who are African-American or Black and they're using their hands all the time. If that's a trigger for you, someone using their hands super close to your face, it's an unlearning on both sides. Just knowing that's a cultural norm. So let's go to Hispanic, Latino communication norms. So generally prefer face-to-face interactions and value personal relationships. The use of both Spanish and English are often with warm, expressive style. It's also important to note that like respect for elders is an important nuance in the, I would say, in the top 4 in African American communities and Hispanic Latino communities, Asian American communities, and Indigenous culture. And respect, when I say this word, often people just think of how we use the form under the guise of white supremacy culture, but also respect is in the way of the inability to question. And so for all of us, you may have had a grandparent that raised you, that you don't ask certain questions to them, right? By asking that question, that can be deemed as a sign of disrespect. All right. And that pops up often in coalition work, as we were talking about ageism earlier, because folks in those communities can view you even asking this question in the tone that you're asking it as being inherently disrespectful, right? Especially when we're talking across generation. So now let's lean into the Asian American community. So often there's varied experiences based on the country of origin. And I always like to share that because everyone likes to act as if the Asian American community is a monolith. But it's not. And there's a focus on education and family honor. And often face the model minority stereotype. Often this community is pivoted, is positioned against Hispanic and African American community in regards to being this model minority. And we even see that right now in our current election. And the influx of folks who are South Asian, who feel super liberated and empowered by having a woman candidate who's running who's South Asian, right? And there's all these stereotypes that are associated to that. When it comes to communication norms, they tend to be indirect and high context in communication, valuing respect, harmony, and nonverbal cues. For those of us that may organize in those communities, often making eye contact or not making eye contact can be deemed as respectful or disrespectful, depending on the age of the elder you're engaging with. I specifically remember launching a canvassing program going into Asian communities, specifically around salon workers, and them training our canvassers that if someone's over this age group, when you first greet and introduce yourself, you don't make eye contact until they acknowledge you, because that was viewed as like a form of disrespect. And so there's those slight nuances that in coalition, I was raised to make eye contact with people when I talk to them. But part of us being in an across race and an across class and an across generation coalition is that you kind of have to unlearn what brings you comfort and find a common ground where we can all be in our own different right to comfort together. All right, so let's shift to the next one. So when it comes to Indigenous communities, some of the common experiences are rich heritage and deep connection to land and traditions, and historical trauma from colonization and forced assimilation. So often just speaking about our systems and believing in them to be equitable can be very triggering and traumatizing for folks who are Indigenous, because we're like, when was it this great? I don't know. And then some communication norms, emphasizing listening and storytelling. This is a hard one, y'all. Valuing silence and nonverbal communication as part of respectful interaction. So now let's lean into white American culture. Now, similar to some of the others, this is very vast, right? And so some of the common experiences involve a diverse experiences based on the socioeconomic status, knowing that someone's whiteness and how they show up in the world varies based on the class that they're raised in, right? There's a slightly different lived experience. And knowing that this is often seen as a cultural norm in the US. And so some of the communication norms are generally favor direct and low context communication and to value individualism and self-expression. A lot of BIPOC folks are taught to decenter ourselves and to not take up a lot of space, and culturally in how we communicate, we may over apologize and say, oh, I'm sorry for taking up space, but we kind of see a slightly different thing in communication norms when it comes from a white American culture. Now, there are some outliers who came from multiracial, multi-generational households that have learned the nuance of both, but it is a common American thing to just feel comfortable taking up a lot of space. So let's move to multiracial individuals. I couldn't be remiss without making space for them because there's some of us who have a unique duality in how we show up. I identify as a Black woman, but technically I'm biracial. And how I show up in the world in certain spaces and how I'm treated in that way definitely makes me navigate across identities slightly different. And so often we can face unique challenges related to identity and belonging. And some of the communication norms, although this is very broad, flexible and adaptive. You'll notice a lot of folks who may be multiracial may over apologize because they've never really have felt comfortable taking up space in either space, especially if one of the things that they're mixed with is something that's considered BIPOC, right? Now, the nuances of someone having two alternating white identities and how that shows up is slightly different. But we definitely see that in folks who are dealing with being an oppressed race that comes from historical oppression, as well as a race that traditionally was afforded certain privileges. And then last, y'all, we can't be America without talking about new immigrants, first or second or third generation to our country, right? Often there's common experiences of adjusting to a new country while maintaining your cultural heritage, as well as balancing those traditional values and new social norms. And then I can't forget to just lift up, there's always often this association to having to feel like you have to assimilate to then become American, right? And lose certain cultural respects that you have. And some of the communication norms may prefer communication in their own native language or a mix of languages. And often they value respect for cultural differences and clear, supportive communication. So I know that was a lot of talking at you. So let's do a temperature check. Put a 5 in the chat if you're like, yeah, that actually summed me up a little bit. I could add a few more points. Put a 3 in the chat. You're like, hey, it was a hit or miss. I don't know if it completely summed me up. And then put a 1 in the chat if you're like, not at all. Not at all, Stephanie. I communicate completely differently. I must be an outlier. This is just checking in, seeing how this resonates with you. Right, I see some 5s, I see some 2s. Right. I see a lot of 2s. Okay, so I want to pick a few folks who shared some numbers to just kind of make some space for you to talk about, you know, why you feel like this may not completely encompass you, and then add the norms that you do feel like it. So I see 4 2s, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but if there's any 2s that are like, yes, I'm waiting to talk about my actual communication norms that I don't feel like are represented here, feel free to just come off mute if you are a person that is a 2. And then I'll make space for some of the 5s in a second. Maddie, I saw you come off mute.
Yep, I was a 2 and I am white, but I feel like as a neurodiverse person, my communication is different from the norms for white people, and tends to be more direct than a lot of other white people seem to prefer.
Yes, Maddie, that is such an important point. That's like a whole nother training when we're talking about working across folks who process information differently, right? And even how we share information differently. No, that's such a great point, because that is, right now we're just centering this in generational and cultural, but yes, that is a whole another thing. Like, how do we work with folks who are neurodivergent, folks who may have ADHD, folks who may need information written for them to retain it. Yes, like those are those other nuances in those communication norms. That's a great point, Maddie. Is there another two that would like to share?
I could go, Stephanie.
Go ahead.
Ashley. So I feel like I can be pretty fluid with my and adaptive, kind of like the what you have listed for multiracial individuals, but I feel most comfortable with emotional expressiveness and kind of getting into like deeper things with people, and the more collective, like I know in general the individualism thing makes sense to me based on my experiences with other people, but um I love being around storytelling and having people be able to kind of break down some of those white American norms.
Yes. And I mean, to be fair, storytelling is something that's across all of the cultures, right? But it's like how we share stories and how they're ingrained in our culture may be slightly different, right? No, I really appreciate that, Ashley. I'd like to get one more two, and then if someone was a 5 or a 4 and would like to share, we'll put you up next.
I guess I could just add, I think like I was a 2 as well, and I think generally those descriptions for white American culture are accurate. But I think there's, as we've talked about with some of these other concepts, there's pretty significant degrees of variation by other identities as well, specifically gender. Like I think white men in particular specifically are encouraged a lot more to take up a lot of space and value that individualism and self-expression, and women have traditionally been taught to take up less space and be more quiet, or at least speaking from my own personal experience, that's something that I was reflecting on. And I think just some other things too that I've like heard along the way that I have adapted with over time in my organizing work. I think of even just the pace and cadence at which you're communicating. People often tell me that I speak a lot slower and clearer than many other white people, which I never really thought about before. That's kind of just the way that I speak.
Yes, that is actually a really important point, Michelle. I actually have a follow-up question. Were you raised in a community that was rural, suburban, or urban?
It was suburban.
Okay. Yeah, so I've often heard about the speed and the cadence in which someone speaks be associated to city folks. For those who may be in the Midwest and organize in places where there are a lot of rural folks, the first way they can tell if someone's from the city is how fast that we speak, right? And there's also the association that fast speakers, right, aren't trustworthy, right? There's association that they're speaking fast for a reason, to be deceptive. And so there are those unconscious associations, which is a whole nother training, just talking about the difference in communication across suburban, rural, and urban communities, and cadence and how fast we speak definitely comes up with that. So I just want to make space for a 4 or a 5 to share. And then we're going to move on, y'all, to the next section on white supremacy culture. I see a question in the chat. I just wanted to acknowledge, Ashley. I saw you asking. I'm not sure if I'm understanding low context and high context communication. A great example is we all have been in a coalition where a very simple question was asked, and someone wants to tell you a story behind it. They want to tell you a 3 to 4 minute story on why our meeting norm is the norm that it is. That's a lot of context, okay, for a very simple question. And so for some of us that come from storytelling households or culture, that's just a normal practice, right? Like, I'm going to tell you the story that goes along with how we got here. But for other folks, that is too much. That's like information overload, right? And so that's part of the unlearning when we move into white supremacy culture, is decentering what you deem as valuable and important and knowing when we're working across race and across class, that high context for some people, they view that as a way to build a bridge, right? In understanding. So yes, cut to the chase, exactly. So is there a 4 or 5 that would like to share? All right, I'm taking silence as none, no pressure, but I see your point, Maggie, about this is such an important point to come up about high and low context and frustrations with both. And so if we go back to where we started in the beginning, talking about those types of conflict, if you get frustrated with someone telling you a story, y'all, that is a process and priority issue, okay? Because if you're just trying to get to the decision without understanding someone's context and their why, you're gonna have an issue with their process. Go ahead, Cheryl. I see your hand is raised.
Well, I have like a historical journey in it. And I'm one of those that likes to explain. And I'll tell you why. Because I was extremely shy when I was growing up. When I started college, that was my first introduction to having a white roommate who was rich and very treating you like you were a slave, mentality. I didn't know how to deal with it, but it was a journey for me as I worked in different environments and went to different graduate schools where I was encountering people that came to America, more of a mix. I just gradually learned by just kind of by listening. I didn't really work on like communicating. I was extremely quiet, but I learned a lot. And so coming into this space over the years has really been an explosion of different groups of people. And it was intriguing to me because I'm not around it. I'm in a Black neighborhood all my life. So I've learned, about their cultures, their expression, the intensity, what it means. Sometimes it was kind of like, whoa, why they're so intense? But I've come to understand it. So I'm more comfortable in these spaces now. But it took all these years of just working with children that had learning disabilities. I was a teacher for a while. That was shocking for me. I had never heard about learning disabilities. So it takes, just keep on living is what I say. Don't beat yourself up too much and be kind to other people.
Absolutely. Sharing stories is often how we build humanity with each other, right? And so for those of us who descend from historical contexts where our humanity was always questioned, sharing stories is also, y'all, a sign of respect, because I deem you worthy enough to share a story so you can have a better understanding of me. And often, y'all, when we lean into white supremacy culture, which is where we're about to go next, having that sense of urgency that you can't even pause and breathe and listen to someone's story is a part of the unlearning process, where we have to unlearn our white supremacy culture trait of sense of urgency. I see a hand raised, Lena, and after this question, we're going to shift to the next section.
Oh, yeah, just kind of piggyback a little bit on what Holmes and Miss Watson was saying, that, sometimes that's true. A lot of times people, they automatically have you summed up, when it becomes black and white. And my thing is that, like, no, don't sum me up. I'm not what you see on the news, on the 5 and 6 o'clock news. I think that's the one that make me the most sick, you know, and then when I say something differently, it's like, oh, you know, it's like, you know, it's almost like I expect you to be a certain kind of way because of what I see on the 5 and 6 o'clock news. And then, and not only that too, I just want to just say this a little bit too, that, you know, how they said we're not, what's that word?
A monolith.
There you go. I know. I remember when I was a teenager and I was going off to college. At first, I wasn't going to go away. My brother told me, "No, Lena." He says, "You just been around our family here. You need to go away to school." And I just went to Ball State, but I noticed when I got there were some black girls there. You think, you know, you kind of mix in real well. I tell you, Stephanie, we had nothing in common. I'm telling you, their speech was not mine. Their experiences was not mine. They were, you know, I mean, I was totally lost. There were just other black folks. And I had to learn that I didn't realize that there were really other black folks. I mean, I was used to, my church was like either Pentecost or Baptist. These black folks were Lutheran and Catholic, and you know, I didn't know no black Lutheran and and like I said, you know, it was a slow learn with them, and you know, we began to notice each other and talk more later. But I'm telling you, that was my wake up call with black folks. We are not the same. That was definitely we'll say news to me. we had different experiences, and they had nothing in common with me. Other than just black. So yeah.
No, I appreciate that. And that's why someone alluded to it earlier. Sometimes when folks are BIPOC, we show up in different spaces where we're code switching, right? Because we may not feel safe to show up in our authentic ways in those spaces. And so often when folks are code switching, I just want to name it, y'all, that is a survivor tactic that was passed down to us generationally.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, and so often it can make us feel personal. We're like, ooh, this person, they are showing up in a way that I don't know. Are you going? But we also just have to give grace and acknowledge that sometimes folks are showing up in a way because they're trying to survive, right?
It is indeed a survivor. That's right.
You know, so no, I definitely appreciate that. So y'all, I'm going to keep moving, but I re-put the workbook in the chat for those of you who hopped in late. This is a guide to everything that we're covering. Yeah. And so let's just do a brief temperature check. So now that we've gone over the spectrum of communication norms, we've talked about it across racial identities. How well do you feel like you understand this now? 5 being like completely, Stephanie, this opened up my eyes. I realized that I am a keep it to the point person. I've been cutting people off. Go ahead, put a 5 in the chat if that is you. And if you're like, man, I kind of get it now, but I feel like there's so much more nuance. I want like 30 more minutes to dive into this. Go ahead and put a 3 in the chat. And then if you're like, not at all, I'm still lost, I hopped on late, go ahead and put a 1. And then after this, y'all, we're going to shift to some white supremacy culture. All right, I see a lot of 5s. If you are a 3 and a 1, no shame, y'all. This just helps us know as facilitators maybe what we need to come back and make more space for later. I appreciate you being honest here about, you cut people off. That's, this is also an awakening thing for you. There's certain things that we do out of habit that we don't even realize could be making people feel like this is a personal interaction, right? Okay. All right, let's keep going. Yeah, we're going to skip this one so that we have time. All right, y'all. So white supremacy culture is not just about extremists. I know when we hear the word white supremacy, we imagine hoods and people carrying signs in the Carolinas saying terrible things. But it's not just about extreme behavior, y'all. It's this unconscious behavior also that is white supremacy culture. And rather than it just being a set of norms that are often so subtle that we may not notice them, and we allow them to exist unchecked. Just like someone said, hey, I actually realized I've been cutting a lot of people off. You might some unchecked components of white supremacy culture that you're still operating under. And so that is why we always show this iceberg, not to reference the Titanic, but it's because what we see in white supremacy culture are like extremists, right? That's everything that's above the water. But the part that shows up in our coalition work, y'all, isn't the above the water white supremacy culture. It's the under the surface. It's the stuff that is so unconscious. We don't even see it as being a component of white supremacy culture. So the workbook I just shared in the chat, on the very, very last page, there is something called a scorecard. And so as I go through these definitions, I want you to copy this document for yourself and to go through and rate yourself 1 to 5. And I like to say not yourself personally, but the organization in which you're operating under, to kind of say if this resonates with you. And so as I go with each one, please feel free to copy the document. This is your own workbook, and then you can start putting numbers in your scorecard. And that way we can like honor both. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So when we think of the characters of white supremacy culture, I want you to think of a shelf of toxins that exist. All right. And if we don't name them and label them, you'll keep drinking from it thinking that it's great. So the purpose of today is for us to identify them, name them, and for you to identify what are the top 3 in your organization that you're operating under right now. Oh, yes, I can share it again. Give me 1 second. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Michelle. All right. So by implementing these practices, oh, yeah. All right. So when we go through white supremacy culture, if you go to the next slide, generally the first one I like to start with, which is not in this order, so we're going to popcorn around, is perfectionism. Someone alluded to it earlier, but the reason why I like to start with perfectionism, y'all, is because we all descend from folks who may have forced you to try to be perfect. And I just want to name y'all, being perfect is not sustainable. We're human. All right. And that in itself is a component of white supremacy culture. Perfectionism is that belief that mistakes are personal flaws. If someone puts their comma in the wrong place, they are uneducated. All right. And that there is only one way to do certain things. Some of the way in which perfectionism can show up in our work is that in personal conflicts, you can encourage a culture of learning, or you can create a culture where people are afraid to ask questions. That latter is a component of white supremacy culture. If everyone's expected to know everything, we'll never hit that mark, right? So that's perfectionism. So then we have only one right way. That is a belief that there is only one right way to get something done. Many of us are sat in a coalition where they're like, if we don't do it this way, I'm off. I'm done. I'm not going to be on the coalition anymore. Y'all, that is actually a component of only one right way. If you all are like, hey, this is what decarbonization should look like in my community, and one person's like, that's dumb, and the fact that you even said that, I'm off the coalition, that's a component of white supremacy culture. It's giving an ultimatum that's rooted in either or thinking. Then it's paternalism. It is that lack of transparency around where power sits, including who makes decisions and how. And so if you don't know who makes decisions in your organization and you've asked multiple times and they haven't told you, paternalism is running rampant in your organization. All right. Worship of the written word. If you have someone who is like, if it's not in a memo, it doesn't exist. If it's not written down, you didn't do it. If I don't see a calendar invite, those are things that are really rooted in white supremacy culture, where it's the worship of the written word. Yes, it can definitely be a power play. Then there's either or thinking. This is one of the ones I see the most. This is that things are either good, bad, right, or wrong. Someone said it earlier. It's either black or white. There's no gray area. For many of us who are women, who have chronic illness, who may be Black or Indigenous or a person of color, we in our liberation existed in the gray. Either or thinking never served us. And so it's important to name that, yes, although it's easy to make decisions if something's either or, it doesn't mean that it's always rooted in equity. So then we have power hoarding. Power hoarding is that belief that power is a limited resource that must be protected, and more power for some is less power for others. We can see this in our presidential election right now, right? There's this narrative that if we get free education, that there's going to be a different amount of people in power in 10 years, right? And some folks are very afraid of what that looks like if it's not rooted in classism. All right, let's go to the next slide. So then we have defensiveness, y'all. Defensiveness is reactive negatively to feedback or criticism. So if someone's like, hey, Linda, you've been sharing some long stories lately in our coalition calls. You're kind of pushing us over our time limit. Defensiveness is immediately responding and taking it personal, right? And two things can be true. I can be a great storyteller, but I also may be sharing stories in the wrong time. And so it's important when we're doing this work is that we practice our unlearning our right to comfort. And we know that we have to protect power. We don't need to protect power and control, especially in coalition work. That doesn't serve us. So then we have right to comfort. Right to comfort is the one I see the most, y'all. Like I would say across all different coalitions that I sit on and I'm a part of, right to comfort is the one that I see the most. That is that belief that those with power have a right to emotional and psychological comfort. So you can put a plus in the chat if this resonates with you. You all may have had a manager where you will point out maybe a flaw. You're like, man, we've been doing this onboarding process this way for 5 years. And I just noticed this one little thing. And in that moment, it becomes an emotional conversation where they may start crying. They're like, why are you criticizing my work? You are being aggressive. And although you may have been coming from a very, very open, heartfelt place because you want to solve the process, right? But they took that conflict that was a procedural thing and they made it personal. And so often right to comfort is a deflection tactic that is often unconscious to a lot of people, that the moment you have a procedural problem, they go into their right to comfort, okay? And that's a component of white supremacy culture. If we take it all the way back to Reconstruction, when folks were saying, I took your litany test and I'm trying to show up to vote and I'm an American citizen. And why can't I vote? There were people who would cry and be like, why shouldn't it be? I'm just telling you, you can't vote, right? And so it's just important to know that this is an unconscious way that folks have right to comfort. So I know some folks are saying they need to go at the top of the hour. We will send the recording, but I just want to get through these last 4 traits of white supremacy culture. Yes, right to comfort. Don't teach CRT in school, right? Because it's going to make a group of students be very uncomfortable. And their discomfort is more valuable than the discomfort of BIPOC students whose narratives are now being centered, right? This is a really good question, Davina. I feel like we got to stay after to answer that one. What if white supremacy cultures are showing up from a person that's African American? Y'all, guess what? We can be our own participants in white supremacy culture because it's so embedded in how many of us have been raised that we're unconscious to it. So yes, it's a whole thing. So I'll make space for that. Let's move to individualism. That is that belief that problems and challenges are best handled alone. Okay, I want to name y'all the individualism is also an outcome of not feeling safe to creatively build with people. So if you have someone on your coalition who's like, I just want to do this by myself. I just want to sit over here and not deal with none of y'all. It also can be a survival tactic because they've tried working with you and coalesce with you and they felt like it wasn't safe. Where now they're okay to do it individually. All right. I'm the only one. This is that belief that if something is going to be done right, I have to do it. I have to do it because I'm the best, most qualified, best person to do that thing. But y'all, that's a component of white supremacy culture. Progress is bigger and more. Now, this is a hard one, y'all, because we're fighting capitalism while we're also fighting white supremacy culture. So this is that belief that success and progress is synonymous with bigger and more is rooted in capitalism. And so often our growth isn't always able to be captured with metrics, right? Building power, you can't always capture with metrics. And so this is an unlearning for us, is that something isn't always better because it's bigger. Sometimes it's less sustainable when it's bigger. And so part of our unlearning is that progress doesn't always have to be bigger and more. It can just be more stable and be less. And so then the very last is sense of urgency, y'all. This is the one that I feel like when it comes to climate work and climate justice and decarbonization, that when we think about those 3 types of conflict, priority, I often see as the the line in the sand, where it's that constant sense of urgency, which makes it difficult to take time to be inclusive, to encourage democratic and or thoughtful decision-making processes. Okay. All right. So with that, I know some of you have filled out the scorecard. If you would just put what you feel like the top 3 are in your organization and just put it for us in the chat. Yes, someone asked why supremacy culture is pervasive and practiced by many. Yes, unconsciously practiced by many. Even how we're taught to be managers. Often they are giving us some of these traits that have it rooted in there. Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Michelle. Defensiveness, right to comfort, and sense of urgency. Yes. And so what you can also see in your workbook, y'all, is I went ahead and gave you practices that you can incorporate in your organization right now for all 3 levels of conflict. So for you, Michelle, if you go into the yellow header that says traits of white supremacy culture, and you look under defensiveness, you'll see for personal conflict, it says, a practice you can do is to foster a culture of open communication where feedback is welcomed and valued. Some people call them feedback meetings, where everyone who comes in there is consenting for feedback, right? And so there are some practices for each one of these areas, y'all, that you can take back with you, mull over it, and identify which one you're willing to incorporate into your organization. Ready? So I know we're at time, and I think this is a great place for us to land the plane together. I saw you, Maggie, about to cue me up. Yeah, so we will have a next session coming up, and I'm going to pass it to you, Maggie, to tee it up. But if there are any questions that you all have, if you're like, ooh, Stephanie, I want a whole nother session with you, I'll put my email in the chat, and you all can always follow up with me.
Yes, perfect. All right. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for leading us through that. And I know we even talked about it while we were planning out this training. We were like, we could do 2 hours so easily, and proved true once again. So thanks, folks, for hanging with us as we had to kind of speed through some things. But I really just wanted to highlight next week, actually on Halloween. So next Thursday, October 31st, Stephanie will be back again along with DeAngelis Garcia Bay to take us through a training on the James principles and grassroots organizing. So please register for that. I put the link in the chat, and you can always find the links to all of our trainings on midwestdecarb.org. And also expect a follow-up email from me with a recording of this training. And we will also be sharing out again a link to that workbook, a link to the slide deck, so that you can share this information with your colleagues, with your friends, with anyone who you think might benefit from it. And then also just have that time to revisit it for yourself. So thank you so much to everyone who was able to join. Thank you to Stephanie, and we will see you all back here next week, hopefully.
Take care, everyone. Good seeing everybody.
Yes. Have a good rest of your Thursday. Bye-bye.